as he mentioned, the stimulus package is hopefully going to create a bunch of jobs. The administration's estimate is that something like a 2% drop in the unemployment rate by the end of 2010, and something like 3.5 million jobs created or saved relative to what the economy would otherwise do. And critical for this is a multiplier, meaning that if the government's spending $1, there's a more than dollar increase in GDP. And the bigger the dollar increase, or the bigger the multiplier, the bigger the jobs impact. And one of the critical studies that we may mention more is a study by Romer and Romer, the same Christy Romer, who's part of the architect of this, is the chair of the Council of Economic Advisors. And that study was actually about tax cuts and not spending increases. And the stimulus package is actually about 2/3 spending increases and 1/3 tax cuts. And they deliberately, if you look at what Christy wrote in early March, she said they deliberately shied away from tax cuts because they're worried people wouldn't spend very much of them. Despite that, they assume a fairly big multiplier, I'm going to argue, or a multiplier that's at least higher than some other estimates out there that we should take seriously. So they assume a multiplier of $1.50. For every dollar of tax cuts and spending, we're going to generate $1.50 in GDP. And this is just, the Romer and Romer study I mentioned is just data. It's just asking, in previous episodes when the government cut taxes, what happened to GDP? And that's a harder question to answer than at first blush, because the government never does something, or rarely does stuff for completely random reasons. If the government cuts taxes because it's worried the economy is weak, you can't blame the weakness in the economy completely on the tax cut. So the Romer and Romer study is an ingenious one, trying to look at episodes where policymakers move for what seem to be reasons unrelated to the current status of the economy. So it's a great paper. But there are other really nice papers out there trying to address this very question. And one of them is this Mountford and Uhlig paper that identifies fiscal policy shocks that are unrelated to other shocks hitting the economy. So they're trying to control for the endogeneity that way. And so what they find, for example, for a government spending increase is basically no multiplier. So this, to me, says not that this is true, put all the weight on this and other studies with smaller multipliers, and no weight on the Romer and Romer, or Romer and Bernstein estimate of the multiplier, but that we have reason to worry that the multiplier might be significantly lower and the jobs impact significantly lower. So if I go a little farther, there's the bipartisan CBO. We have a former director of the CBO with us here. I think this is an amazing, outstanding organization that does a lot of public good. Anytime the government is passing a bill, it's giving an independent economist assessment of what that bill will do. And there's obviously a lot of uncertainty. If we had all the answers, we wouldn't be in this crisis. But we can do the best we can do in trying to figure out what the effect's going to be. So they estimate a stimulus spending plus tax cuts of about 2% of GDP in 2009, and they have a range of estimates. And the range of estimates is a 1% stimulus to GDP, the total production, to up or 3%. So you're noticing that their multiplier is actually either 1/2 at the low end or 1.5 at the high end. So they're putting a significant amount of weight on lower numbers than in the administration's estimates. So I think we have reason, and so their forecast is that at the end of 2010, the upper end is maybe 3.6 million jobs created or saved, but the low end is 1.2 million. So the administration's forecast is at the upper end of that, so it should give us pause to worry that we might not get as many jobs as they're hoping. So how do you get a big multiplier? I mean, this is just a statement about data assumptions that are made. So how do people get these out of models? How would you get anything less than a multiplier of 1? If the government's purchasing stuff, doesn't that create $1 of GDP? Isn't that the worst case scenario? But the best case scenario should be more spending, but how could you possibly get something less? So let me briefly say, everybody may be comfortable with, but the canonical Keynesian story is prices are stuck. So supply is actually flat, and it's actually very passive. Demand is too low, but price just can't adjust down. And so supply turns out to be, in some sense, again, passive, so demand is all powerful. So the role is for the government to step in and kick up demand, and then there will be no supply constraint, no price adjustment. You'll see a 1-for-1 increase in production, and then the consumers will turn around and spend some of that, and you'll get a multiplier greater than 1. That's the canonical undergraduate textbook Keynesian multiplier. Okay, so what might be wrong with that? What have we learned in the last 30, 40, 50, 60 years relative to that canonical multiplier? The new Keynesian models tend to get smaller multipliers. And two key reasons emphasized in the quick Kogan, Quick, Taylor, Whelan paper that you guys got are that we've accumulated a lot of evidence that consumers and firms are forward-looking. That consumers don't just consume a fixed fraction of their current income, some high fraction. So we can't rely on people to take the income from the government and turn around and spend it, a high fraction of it. And same thing with firms. Firms are going to be forward-looking and care about the cost of financing investment projects that they undertake now going into the future. And the second thing is endogenous monetary policy. I will respond directly to Brad on this one. The Quick et al., or Kogan et al., made some different assumptions than Bernstein and Romer did. That's kind of by definition, or else they would have come to the exact same answer. So of course they made different assumptions. The question is, were those assumptions interesting, reasonable, worth considering, and therefore worth putting weight on when we forecast what jobs will do? And I think the answer is absolutely yes. So we know that monetary policy is endogenous to the state of the economy. We know that. In fact, we have the Taylor rule that describes that in a particularly concise way. That's one of the most influential papers in economics in the last 20 years. And having worked in the Federal Reserve System for 3 years, I know that from my experience then and from people I talk with now, that there's a debate going on in the Federal Reserve about how expansionary to be. And they're looking at the stimulus package and saying we don't have to be as expansionary as we otherwise would be. We don't have to be as aggressive with our unconventional tools. We're still being very aggressive, but there's a question of how aggressive. And I think we have to put probability on the idea that's assumed in the simulations you saw in that Kogan et al. Paper, that monetary policy won't be as expansionary as it otherwise would be, precisely because fiscal policy stimulus was passed. Okay, so on this issue of will consumers respond, can we count on the multiplier being above 1, or even people spending a big part of the tax cut, in addition to all the microeconomic studies that have been done about how individuals respond to changes in their individual income? The more permanent it is, the bigger the response. The more temporary it is, the smaller the response. There's a striking episode in 2008 where we had these stimulus checks written in June and July that increased average disposable household income by $600, and nothing happened to consumption. So I'm saying I don't know that this means that consumers won't spend any of the tax cut part or the additional income from the government jobs. They won't turn around and spend a large fraction of it. But it certainly means we should put significant weight on that probability. And Romer herself did it in her description just 2 months ago about why they didn't rely on very big tax cuts. They're worried consumption's not going to respond. And so for that very reason, you can't rely on a big multiplier from that end. And then on the endogenous monetary policy side, we are at an interest rate lower bound. We are stuck at 0. But interest rates on risky borrowing are much higher. They're higher than they were before the recession. So to try to get float corporate bonds or commercial paper, and the Fed can move those things. Brad didn't quite suggest this, but let me pretend he suggested that the Fed might be powerless. We know when the Fed started buying commercial paper, the commercial paper rate went down. We know when the Fed started encouraging mortgage-backed securities, the mortgage rates went down. So I don't think the Fed's powerless just because it can't go any lower on the Treasury bill rate. It's got plenty of room to take aggressive action on these other rates. And it's going to do less of this probably because we have expansionary fiscal policy. Because again, there's hawks inside the Fed and there's critics outside saying the Fed is being too aggressive, is doing too much on liquidity, and that's going to be inflationary down the road. They've got to pull back. So those arguments are going to be stronger if we have a stimulus package in the background from the fiscal side. So let me show you this simulation that you have in your packets from the Kogan et al. Paper. So this is the blue bars are the path of the government purchases, state and local, that they think might. This is actually the estimates from Romer and Bernstein of how much government spending will be stimulated at the federal and local level. And then the red line is their estimate of what that will do to GDP. So the fact that the red line is below the blue bars is saying that they are estimating out of this new Keynesian model, which is a new Keynesian model that's pretty popular. It's in use at the European Central Bank. It has a lot of influence at the Fed and the Bank of England. In fact, it's based on a paper that I actually don't love, and I'm going to criticize this model in a second, but it's like the most cited paper in economics in the last 10 years is what this model is based on. So there's reason to at least look at this and pay some attention to it. So this model implies this multiplier of less than 1, this new Keynesian model where you have forward-looking consumers and forward-looking firms rather than mechanistic, just consume a high fraction of your current income consumers and no Fed response. So what does that mean? That means that private spending is falling. If the multiplier is less than 1, for every dollar of GDP we get from the government purchases, we're losing some of what the GDP we would have gotten from consumption and investment. And those aren't trivial here. You can see that that's where what's happening. We get a 0.5% of GDP increasing from the government and maybe a 0.2% loss from consumption and investment.